joining and getting our audio connected and testing out the chat. I see about 16 of you on the phone right now, and we're expecting hopefully a little bit over 100 people joining today. As you're coming in, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where you're from in the Zoom chat window. So that will be on your Zoom panel, your control panel for the webinar. You'll see a little chat bubble, and that is what you will use to talk to everybody. When you are using the chat, make sure that you have all panelists and attendees selected in the drop-down. Hi, all. Sasha. Hi, Sasha. Alyssa from Chicago. Great. You guys are finding the chat window. Mike's here from Minneapolis. Hi, Mike. We're neighbors. I'm in St. Paul right now. Great. Wanda from Wisconsin. You are in cold Alberta, Canada. Yes, we relate. Okay, great. Yeah, come in if you're just joining us. We're going to be starting in a couple minutes, just giving everyone a chance to join in and introduce yourselves in the chat window. As you're joining and you're looking to introduce yourself in the chat window, make sure that you are selecting in the to field all panelists and attendees. By default, I think it's selected to all panelists, and that will only come to Ethan, myself, and to Rich, who's my co-host today, and Ethan will be conducting most of the webinar. But there's a little drop-down that says all panelists and attendees. If you select that, then everyone in the webinar will be able to see your chat entry instead of just the panelists. Great. So Ruth Simmons just got it. Hi, Ruth. You're in Edina. Maura's got it. Okay, great. The last few people who've been chatting in the window have selected all panelists and attendees, and that means everyone can see what you're chatting. Now, of course, if you want to say something privately to the attendees or to the panelists, rather, feel free to do that. Just make sure that you are selecting the audience that you would like to speak with. So we'll get started in a minute or two. Again, I'm Ellen Burns-Johnson. I'm kind of the chat window guru today. Ethan Edwards will be running most of the webinar. We're doing a little program preview today for our design program. Thanks, Ethan. We can just leave it up there for a little bit while we have more people joining. Yeah. So most of you have already found the chat window, but if you're just joining, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat window. Just make sure that you are selecting in the to column. You're selecting all panelists and attendees. So on the presentation right now, you can see a little screenshot on the bottom right, kind of showing what that drop-down will look like. Make sure that you start with all panelists and attendees. That way, everyone who's on the web can see what your chat entry is. So if you're just joining, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from in the webinar chat. We have people from all over, people from Nigeria, Mexico City, from Canada. Keith's from Pennsylvania. Very cool. Okay. All right, one last little call. For those of you just joining, I think we saw another 10 people or so join in the last few minutes. We're introducing ourselves in the chat window. Just make sure to select all panelists and attendees before you enter your message. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Ooh, let's go back one more. Yeah. Thanks, Ethan. So Ethan's driving today. My name is Ellen Burns-Johnson. I'm going to be your chat support. So if you have any questions for Ethan or for me, for anyone about the content of today's webinar, go ahead and enter that at any point in the chat window, and I'll be jumping in occasionally to read your questions out loud and to get them answered if Ethan would like to speak to those. The rest of today's session is going to be run by none other than Ethan Edwards, who's going to give us a little bit of a preview of our 4-course design program through the Allen Academy. So Ethan, why don't you take it away from here and get us started?
Okay, well, thank you, Ellen. Yeah, as Ellen said, this is just a little snapshot of what the experience is like. We've been giving webinars to promote these our academy, and often people say, well, what is the experience like? And so we just wanted to spend a little time sharing some content to give you an idea of what the overall experience is like. First, I want to say why we started the Academy for any of you who have not been on a previous webinar. And it really is due to the continuing need that people are not getting the right information all the time that they need to become really competent and skilled in doing great e-learning. The Academy deals with more than strictly e-learning, but this first program we have is really focused on what's unique and necessary about creating e-learning that makes a difference. And particularly learning how to do more with the tools. We find that people take elementary training on using tools, but they don't necessarily learn how to, what do you need to know to become a really competent e-learning developer? So we have tool components. How do you actually apply some of the learning theories to actual problems that people have? I went through graduate school in educational psychology with instructional design. And while it provided a really great underpinning, a lot of the real relevance to how people learn online came through work. And we want the Academy to provide some of that insight that we've developed at Allen Interactions over the last 30 years. And then also, a lot of people are needing to become experts in this, and they're sadly often working alone. Some people are lucky to have a whole team that they can work with, but when you're working on your own, it's hard to practice and get mentoring. And so part of the program also is to share our expertise and our time in a way to shepherd new developers or inexperienced developers and designers to make sure that what we learn in the Academy is going to apply to the real world. So that's, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do. This first program is called the Allen Certified Instructional Professional, and it consists of 4 courses. First, there's a Designing Interactivity course. We call it 101. And it really is setting the stage for everything you need to know for creating meaningful and memorable e-learning modules. We follow that with a software course. We have cohorts in Storyline and in Captivate. And so we work through the tools and really try to figure out some things that maybe aren't obvious, but are essential for being able to be efficient and effective in creating the kind of interactions we learned about needing to build in the 101 course. After that, the third course is really more about instruction, taking all the things we knew, but thinking about learning theory, how different instructional problems require different approaches and how we make those decisions. Because we've got a little bit of the tool under our belt, there'll be more exercises where you actually are putting things into practice rather than just talking about them. And then finally, what we're really pleased about is the capstone project that takes this all together and gives the participants a chance to work on a project of their own with coaching. The idea is that, at the end, you'll have a reasonable new piece of training that is your own, that really is, you've practiced and had coaching to make this possible to do on your own. Okay, so that's the big idea. We're just going to show a little bit, and in preparing for this, it was a little awkward because I'm sort of diving right in to give you a little bit of the sample of the training. So I hope that it all makes sense. There'd be we're not starting the beginning of the course, of course, but I just want to take a little content out. So I want to make a couple interactive statements here. First off, what we try to do in the training is have things as much as conversational as possible and have discussions. We're doing this online, and so it's limited, of course, by the chat windows and so forth, but we really think we have done a good job of opening that up and creating spaces for people to contribute together and so forth. But hopefully there's a non-controversial statements that are going to feed what I'll be talking about in just a few moments, is that learners remember what they do. Telling isn't teaching, and all learners have different needs. If we take these things seriously, it really has to impact the standard way we develop instruction online. Because I've found that a lot of e-learning designers spend an awful lot of time writing content, perfecting PowerPoint slides, recording video, and it's all about the telling and the presentation. But the interactivity, which is a critical element in e-learning modules, is sort of overlooked. So I want to take a look at a simple interaction. It's one that I think you probably, the sort of thing you have seen often. Let me pop this in. So I've got a couple of versions of this. The first is the base interaction. And this is an interaction and content that was taken from some content we did with a client. And it was about supervisor effectiveness. And basically, this little module was about when you're a new supervisor, how do you assess problem statements that arise in the environment? And here, there's a question. Assume that some content had been provided. You have a responsibility to promptly address employee behavior that poses a threat to others. Which of these statements represents the most immediate threat to workplace safety? So A, expression of frustration with ordinary office environment, criticism of team members, threatened act of violence, expression of personal emotional distress, expression of irritation with family or family members. So we can, I ran this just before. And it remembered that I'd been in. Sorry. Let's try this again.
Hey, Ethan, while we're refreshing your interaction, I had a question from the audience. Ruth was wondering, you mentioned that learners have different needs, and Ruth was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Well, what it means is that people have different things that they need to practice on. Everybody doesn't have the exact same problem. Some things they might already know. And so one of the things that we have found that kills participation is if somebody is more skilled and they're having to go through training and the training doesn't acknowledge that. Or if someone is a little bit lost and needs more work and yet their lesson moves on, they're not able to keep up. And so one thing that has to happen is e-learning has to adapt. That is, in the way information is presented, perhaps, but more importantly, the way people are put to work with it. There needs to be a way to provide the kind of practice that each learner needs differently. And the way most e-learning is the author decides, these are the 10 questions everyone's going to answer. And you end up with a lesson that doesn't really respond to individual needs. And so that's one of the things you need to figure out how to do, is to give different feedback based on the kind of error you made. Because if the lesson just says, no, that's wrong, there could be 10 or 12 different reasons why the person was mistaken. And we need to make some effort to match what we say to individual needs, or else it becomes a non-communication event. The learner doesn't really pay attention. So that's what we mean by every learner needs different things. We want to get them all to the same endpoint, but they need to have different resources to get there. Okay, so here we have our question. When I make a choice, incorrect, no, there's a higher ranking concern. Very, very straightforward question. It's the kind of question that you get out of the box in almost any e-learning that you see coming. And I just want to say, what's good and bad about that interaction? So just in chat, if you have responses to that, just real quickly, add some phrases that represent, if you think that's good, you think that's bad, what do you think is lacking in that? Yep.
Okay,
So
getting some responses.
Yeah, Ruth is saying no context. But then it does tell you if you're correct or not. You get immediate feedback, but it doesn't really give you anything helpful. As Robert says, there's no follow-on information. Yeah, it's not very interactive. And yet, someone could say it's plenty interactive. It doesn't do anything until the learner makes choices and you get individualized feedback. But as you can tell, it's not great. Well, what's great about it isn't, what's not great isn't just the questioning, it's lacking really some essential components. And what it is we need instructional interactivity, the idea of what makes an interaction instructional, that it actually changes behavior. And we've been working with this idea for many, many years. And it's sort of a core concept, and we spend a lot more time in the class about it, but I just want to introduce this idea. As someone said in the chat, that it needs context. And by context, we mean that you need to provide some framework for the interaction. Tie it in some way to the performance environment and provide relevance and meaning in the real world. Words on the screen mean very little. And so we have a lot of tools at our disposal as a designer to bring life to these things. So one really easy way to do that is to simply add context. You can either add context sort of by imagery or storytelling. Those are sort of your best ways. And I just, for the sake of our demoing, I said, what if we took that exact same question and all we did was rearrange it so that instead of it being in an academic textbook environment, we put workers in an office and that they're making these expressions. These are exact same things, but instead of being ABC, they're linked to something that somebody might say. So she's giving an expression of irritation with friends or family members. If I select that, incorrect, no, there's a higher ranking concern. So it's still not much better, but it's not great, but it's amazing how simply creating context changes the whole way that the learner establishes this. So first step is if we add context. Now that's not enough, as we know that the next component in instructional interactivity is challenge. That is, there has to be something that's a little bit difficult. And I don't mean difficult in a mean or ornery way, but just that you have to attend to it. When a learner can proceed through a lesson without paying attention, just by hitting next, or there's not any consequence for having clicked the wrong answer, there's no challenge. And very quickly, a learner will pay zero attention, even though they're spending time. And so then the whole thing becomes a waste. What we want to do by adding challenges require attention, motivation, intention, risk. All these things create a need for the learner to pay attention. So they must attend to details and be careful of the response. Now you can do this in lots of ways, and I just, in our simple example here, just added a tiny difference. And so instead of just having actually we remember these context things, the statements are exactly lifted out of the content. And so it's just a matter of sort of pattern matching. You don't have to think about it too much if you remembered just the superficial aspects of what you said, what the content said. And so a really simple way to increase the challenge is to require more interpretation. And so here, instead of having a description of the content, now we have actual statements. My boyfriend was so late getting to the movie, I wanted to kill him. So that as a learner, I have to think now, who's being threatened? Is that work or anything. This also adds story elements that make it more compelling. So I hate this stupid printer that always screws up my documents. You can see in a tiny way that this has become, it requires more thought and more effort from the learner, which you'd think in the backwards, would it make them less motivated? In fact, it makes learners more more involved because they feel like they are creating part of the dialogue. So so some days you just want to end it all. And I get some feedback, no, there's a higher priority here. I can look around and so forth. I didn't have this set in this that you can have retries. But so there's a lot more sophisticated ways to create challenge, but just my baseline idea of creating challenge is just make people think. Now the next component of interactivity is activity or an action. You need to create gestures that suggest actions in the real world. Avoid generic academic responses. So what I mean by that is, you know, the A, B, C, and D of the first example represents having the learner practice something that they're never going to do in real life. You don't ever sit there and make choices clicking buttons. And just the fact that the training is based on that adds a layer of artificiality that it's easy to dismiss. Instead, we want to make physical gestures that represent what would happen if you were actually doing this. And again, there's a ton of different ways to approach this. And this is just one example. And we're going to have a moment in a minute for you to brainstorm some ideas. But here, to create activity, instead of just clicking on things, we have an action you need to take. Is that you've got, I need to listen in on people. So the information is not given to me. I need to decide, well, what's this guy saying? Hey, the stupid printer always screws up my documents. What's she saying? Some days you just want to end it all. And then I have to decide and physically take the person who I think is at risk into my office. So I'm going to take her down here and put her. No, it's still wrong, but that in a simple way, making sure that there are actions that, you know, I can realize, okay, if I notice something going on, I'm gonna have to take action. I'm gonna have to have a conversation with this person. And it's subtle, but embedding that in this training makes this interaction so much more meaningful. Okay, and then finally, we have one more component of that's essential for instructional interactivity, and that
Hey, Ethan?
is, yeah.
Ethan, just before we go on, I'm wondering if you can speak to, this might be a little bit more in the details than we want to get on this particular session, but one of our attendees noticed that there were two statements that seemed to need some immediate attention, one that seemed a suicide risk and one that mentioned gasoline and a match. Right. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to why, when this content was originally developed, there were kind of two right answers, even though you showed it when you selected the woman who said, some days you just want to end it all, there was actually a higher ranking concern. Could you speak a little bit about that nuance? Yes. Yeah,
well, that was written very specifically to make the learner struggle with that, because indeed there actually is only one right answer, according to the rules. And they really wanted this to make sure people understood the nuances of the rule. The guy who's going to use the gasoline and a match, according to their policy, is definitely a higher priority than the suicide person, because he's threatening other people's lives. I know it's sort of a subtle thing, and of course you wouldn't have all of these competing at the right moment, at the same moment probably, but that's part of the content and part of the thing that the subject matter experts want to make sure people understood, that somebody threatening others is actually a bigger responsibility for you than somebody who is just a threat to themselves. And, you know, when you start talking about this, it seems so callous, but, you know, you have to figure out those policies and making sure that people understood that that's what your role is to look out for, and those are some of the things that are going to help you decide. Now, this training actually that I'm showing was part of a blended solution, and so there's never a right answer, because some people could interpret, well, the guy talking about the gas, he was joking. That's where your expertise and the live aspect of this sort of can't be completely reflected in an online experience. But the instructors were so pleased that this got people talking about those things and realizing that, okay, this is my responsibility as a supervisor. And so, in fact, one thing you'll notice, good e-learning sort of, and not in a tricky way, but the best e-learning happens when you make mistakes. There's hardly, and so you want to write interactions that people are going to make the wrong choice on, because that learning experience of making that choice and learning the feedback from that is really essential. I didn't have all the feedback in this reconstruction of it, but in the actual piece it says that there's somebody with a higher ranking concern. The only reason this isn't highest is she's only threatening herself. Yeah, Robert.
Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah, Robert, I understand that this is something you'll need to take up with the client. This was with the content that they had decided their policy was, and this content really isn't ours. It's their policy, and this instruction was built to reflect that policy. And again, I do think it would be treated differently if it were not completely part of the blended solution, where the absoluteness that comes through e-learning often can be tempered a bit by discussion. Okay, so we've got context, challenge, action, and feedback, and now the final piece that's necessary is there has to be feedback. You need to reflect back to the learner how they're doing, because without the feedback, no instruction occurs. And oftentimes, the feedback is in e-learning is just no, you're right, or yes, you're right, or no, you're wrong, which is not very helpful to someone who doesn't know what's going on. And so one thing you want to do is provide two aspects of the feedback that I think that are important. And again, this example is created for clarity, not completeness. But if you wanted to up the feedback here, when I make a mistake, let's see, I think I'm gonna let me take her in. Forget which one I had working. Yeah, so what's the result? It isn't that you got it wrong, it's that the guy who was a bigger threat was unattended. And again, we'd make this very different if we were working it out fully. And actually, the other part of this, I think I lost my example, was that, maybe if I try it again here, feedback. That it actually gave more information when I brought him here. Yeah, when it's correct, you get the content more than just it's correct. A threat to other employees is called a dangerous situation and must be dealt with first. That it's actually reinforcing the content rather than just giving status. And that, the explosion is something we call intrinsic feedback, is that when you can, if you've set up context, it's really useful to provide the consequences in that context to remind the learner of what is the result of not doing this correctly. So anyway, that's a very shorthand and simplified version for the purpose of this short session to show what these components are that we need to to change an interaction into something that's instructional. I just want to take a couple seconds here to give you a challenge and think and add your response in the chat window. Is, let's say you're creating an online basic culinary arts program, and you have to have an interaction that's going to teach somebody how to soft boil a perfect egg. Just real quickly, these ideas, we're not going to have much time to fully form it, but think for a moment and share your ideas of how you might introduce context, challenge, activity, and feedback into how that interaction could be built. The critical things are, and we could have debates here, but we're just going to assume that we know the content. But you put the egg in the water, you bring it to boil. How long you bring it to boil? You take it out of the water. Do you cool it under cold water or not? Okay, Greg is suggesting video snippets. How does that create, what element of our CCAF, context, challenge, activity, feedback, would that be addressing? Like Karen's graphical description of the egg and water you set, and you get a timer, you select it when to stop cooking. Yeah, so you're actually, as you say, gamifying it. Kitchen scene, physically gather ingredients, tools needed, drag an egg to a pot of water, set temperature.
Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you'd like to have everyone see your response, make sure that your two selection in the chat window, the drop-down, is selected on all panelists and attendees. Some of you have all panelists chosen, which means that only Ethan and I can see it. But you have great ideas, so I want to make sure everyone sees them.
Yeah, these really are great. I can't read them all out, but you're really right on top of the idea. First, the uniform thing across the board is, instead of answering a question, you're putting the learner to work boiling an egg. And we don't have the details yet of how we make that happen, but you're in the kitchen, you've got the pot, you're moving the egg, you're managing the timer, you're having to decide what the right time is. And some have I think somebody suggested then, if it's, your judgment is not based on the right answer so much as is the egg and good, is it a good egg? Is a person satisfied with it? Yeah, and then you could have feedback with the chef helping you, as Sasha's saying here. Yeah, so we would spend a lot more time with more complicated examples, thinking about how you can transform interactions by applying this method, this design. And it's really funny, the more you work with it, the more you realize how ridiculously powerful it is in its simplicity. Yeah, I like that, Joe. Get you a Gordon Ramsay avatar in here. That may or may not be motivating. I don't know. It depends how much he's yelling at you. But at any rate, so we spend time really investigating that, looking at a lot of examples across different content areas to really think about how we can increase the meaningfulness and the motivation that a learner brings to an interaction. Because if those things aren't up and running, it doesn't matter what they see. And you can see it just even in that little tiny transformation, how much more impactful that simple question was when adjusted to have context, challenge, and action feedback, rather than just being a question out of the box. The interesting thing about this is that it sounds like I'm criticizing multiple choice questions. Well, I'm criticizing stale multiple choice questions because this last example, where we left the our example, I don't see why am I not being able to, here. This is just a multiple choice question. It just doesn't look like one. And about 99% of what you're ever going to build in e-learning are multiple choice questions. And your task as a designer is to figure out how to make it feel like the learner's doing something much more sophisticated. Now, so part of it is this design thinking of context, challenge, action, and feedback. The other impediment, and as we're going to move into the preview of this next course, just to give you an idea of what we do there, is I might have great ideas, but I don't know how to build them. And oftentimes we are forced into having that role, that we don't have the luxury of having a specialist around to build our work for us. And my experience with most authoring tools is that they can do a lot more than we think they can, but it's difficult to get beyond the initial steps that we're taught. And really what we need to do to make them powerful is to break down some of those barriers. So I want to just share a little bit with you about how in the 102 course, how we start looking at some of the tools. And I'm going to take a look at Storyline. Hopefully, if you have some background in Storyline, this is going to make a lot of sense. If you haven't, hopefully it'll make a little bit of sense, but it'll give you a sense, at least some idea of how we go about teaching this. In the real core, and really I want to sort of focus on how object states in Storyline are so very, very powerful and how much they can provide if we really look at them beyond just making a button look like it's pressed or not. So I do want, in the real course, when we're teaching this, even though we're in different parts of the world, it really works great if you have two monitors and you're running Storyline on your own machine. And we're working on these things together. There's parts where come on, I gotta try to flip over. Oh, I need to get out of here, sorry. Where you are watching, but it's essential to try things when people are together. And so I demo things, or the instructor demos some things, talks about some structures within Storyline that you might have played around with but haven't worked with extensively. And then we talk about how to build them. We give some time to build them together, and we make sure that all those steps are clear. And then we have brain teasers that are things that people do on their own between the sessions where they apply these things over. So what I have here is a sort of a simplified version of what we were just looking at. It's an interaction. We use the form view so that it has the learners clicking on these speech bubbles. It's the 4 choices. One of them's correct and 4 are wrong. And if you've used the free form pick one, it gives you some feedback options automatically. And so as we preview this, you can see that this is a sad part of this, is the delay all the time of previewing. But previewing is so important to make sure that the work you're doing is actually what you're expecting. So I just want to show what I have as a starting point. We would have built this together, but we enhance it step by step. And one of the problems is that when you use the free form feedback, you have to use these built-in feedback messages. And it's hard to make intrinsic feedback and to make it fit into your context when you're limited to a pre-built format. So one thing that we can do that isn't as easy as can be, but you don't really realize it, is the reason the feedback comes up is the storyline creates for us 3 default layers that are the feedback layers. And unfortunately, we can't edit them. You can edit the message, but you can't change the look of this. There is an option that you can say which master you're using, and you can switch to classic. But when we really want to integrate the feedback into the context you built, this isn't going to work. But what you can do is you can get rid of these default feedback. So if we delete those, we're going to just get rid of the feedback messages that Storyline put in for us. And you delete them simply by clicking on the layer down here in our layer tab. You see down in the lower right, and click on the garbage can, and that gets rid of those layers. But you're probably thinking, well, that just screwed up our interaction because now I have no way to give feedback, and that free form format is relying on those being there. And now we have no feedback at all. Well, what we can do is create our own layers. And as long as we name them the same way, so I'm going to create my own custom layer called correct. And on correct, I'm going to, this could be Gordon Ramsay, but I don't have his picture, but I'm going to insert a coach. So I want to go to our media library. And we have a picture of a coach here that I'm going to insert. And now our coach is on our correct layer. And I'm going to put him down here in our white space. And I'm going to give him a speech bubble. And I'm going to move that around so it's coming out of his mouth. And I can just make that, format that so it's got, it's filled with white. And make our text black and say, that's correct. And explicit or implicit threat to others is the most pressing issue and must be dealt with first. Okay, so there we have our own correct, and I can do the same thing by duplicating that, calling it incorrect, and then we just change what our feedback is there and say, no, go back and review the standards for evaluating threats. And then I can do one last one. Let's try again. And as long as I name these exactly with these titles, and I'll try again. I'm going to say, excuse the typos. I know we don't have that much time here. So those are, let's see. No, there is a higher ranking concern. Now, when I preview this, those standard canned formats are going to be replaced with my custom ones. So when I get this wrong, nope, there's a higher ranking concern. That's correct. So simply by creating your own, because a lot of people often think, well, I got to be stuck with exactly with what form view gives me. And it's so convenient to set up questions this way, but there's a great deal of way that you can customize them for your own. Anybody have questions about that? The trick is just to make sure that you name them correct, incorrect, and try again. Okay, so I just want to show one other thing here in our last few minutes, and that is that you might want to have 4 different feedback messages for these, and the form view only allows you to have 1 incorrect. When indeed you might want to have 4 different incorrect messages. So if I pick, some days you just want to end it all, you might want to really say, this is a very high ranking worry, but according to our rules, the only reason it isn't is that there's one that's got more people being threatened, which is a way different sort of feedback you would give than if I say my boyfriend was so mad getting in the movie I wanted to kill him, which in case you'd say, you might want to talk to this person, but it's unlikely that this is a statement that is actually going to be put into practice. And we want to keep the benefit of the free form question, but I'm sort of linked into only having try again, incorrect, and correct. And also, if I have all those different feedbacks, it sort of becomes a real estate issue of when do I show something and how do I erase it? So what I'm going to show you, I have found to be just really very, very useful. And that instead of having our feedback in these layers, we would have, we're going to have an object on the main layer that we can change what it says based on using states. So here's my first, I'm going to copy this or cut this feedback from correct. So I'm going to cut that. And go ahead and paste it onto my base layer. So we see down here in the timeline, I now have the coach, and it's always a good idea to name your objects. So we have the coach and we have feedback. Now you're saying, well, it's sitting there before we've done anything. Well, you can fix that by just giving instructions here. Say, select the statement that represents the highest threat. Okay, now what I want to do is make states for that here for, and if you haven't done this, this is more, it's available in any object that you create on this timeline. It isn't just for buttons. You can go to the states portion, and I have my speech bubble selected. I'm going to edit the states. And by default, an object only has 1 state, but we're going to add additional states. This button here says create a new state. And it asks us to name it. And there are the standard states, hover, down, selected, disable, and so forth, that are really useful if you're doing regular buttons. But I'm going to make custom states. I'm going to call this suicide. because this is going to be the feedback if I picked the option of some days you just want to end it all. And so this creates a second state that's got the exact same speech bubble, but I'm going to edit that to say, while this employee is greatly troubled, there is an issue of higher ranking concern. Remember, a threat to others is the highest priority. Again, we can fine tune the content. I'm just wanting to make sure we have the idea there, okay? And then we could have another state that we'll call correct. We'll add that. And then here we'll say, yes, an explicit or implicit threat to others is the highest priority. Now, when we're done editing states, all we need to do is we can get rid of our feedback displays. So we might want to have other processing take place, but I'm going to, we'll have nothing actually being displayed in these. I'm going to clear out my incorrect.
Ethan, as you're clearing that out, just want to do a quick time check. We've got about 10 minutes to go, and I'd like to, in the next couple minutes, talk a little bit about the program structure.
Yeah, I will be done in about 2 minutes here.
Cool beans.
I just wanted to finish this last to show the impact and how great it is to use these things on states rather than having separate objects. Okay, so what I've done here, and I've gone so fast, is I had those speech bubbles spread out across these 3 layers with them explicitly stated. And instead, I have one object on the base layer, and it's the various content areas are controlled by states. So I don't have to erase or worry about anything overlapping because it's all in the same place. And so then the only thing we have to do then is when I click on some days you just want to end it all, which is here, I'm going to add another trigger that when I click on that, I'm going to change the state of what did I call that? Feedback. I'm going to change that to be suicide. When I click on the good choice, or the correct choice, 2 things would solve this department. On that one, I'm going to add a trigger that changes the state of feedback to correct. So now when we run this, all that's going to happen is when I make the selection, the question is going to run just like it did because of freeform. But now I'm going to be able to shuffle the feedback messages simply by changing the state of that column. So let's hope it works. Preview this scene. Now, when in the real course, we do this, and then I would have people either follow along or, okay, now go and do this for the third response. So what are you going to say when the person says, my boyfriend was so late, I want to kill him? So let's see, here we have The instructions select the statement that represents the highest threat. I pick her. Boom. While this employee is greatly troubled, there's an issue of higher ranking concern. Remember, a threat to others is the highest priority. So I come here and pick this guy. Boom. Yes, an explicit or implicit threat to others is the highest priority. And so it's amazing how slick this becomes when you're editing. And then if you want to change it or manipulate this, you only have one place to have to do that. You come right to the object, check states, and you can edit different messages. And then as you copy this and paste it, it's really easy to recreate. And it's so much easier to check this than having things flipped out across different layers. Okay, so I'm going to return to our session. I know we're coming up to the end. So I hope that gave you a little bit of an insight into how we go about this and what sort of the type of instruction we're working in Storyline. You know, we're not teaching it from the ground up. We want people to at least be familiar with the interface and the basic functioning, but we're trying to teach those things that you're not likely to figure out on your own. But they make a huge difference in a practicing developer. Okay, so I'll turn this back over to you, Alan, or if there's other questions I didn't process while I was talking. But yeah, what's next for us here?
Well, we had a couple questions about specific Storyline development technicalities, but I don't think we have time to go in those today, although that sounds really interesting. What I would like to do is just for the last...
I can stay on for a few minutes to answer those after we're done, if that would be useful.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. So, yes, who asked that question? Luwanda, I think, was asking about feedback by choice. So if you're interested in asking Ethan about some of the Storyline techniques that he just demonstrated, hang on for a little bit afterwards, and Ethan will answer those questions for you. For the rest of you, we saw a couple questions about the structure of the program, so I'd like to speak to that briefly now. The design program is a 4-course program, and the first program starts with kind of the delving into instructional interactivity that Ethan started with. And the second program is about the tool, and the third program is about kind of putting it all together. The final course in the 4-course program is actually a practicum, and we think, I think this is one of the elements that we are most excited about. One of the things Ethan mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar was, you know, you can get a lot of instruction about theory and you can get instruction about tools, but getting instruction that helps put those pieces together and then helps you, you know, put it to work in your current role is hard to find. And that's what we're trying to do with our current 4-course program. So the last piece of the design program is a practicum, a 2-week period where you work on your own work and you're able to interact directly with your instructors and get help. And build something that you can use, or start building something that you can use. So we really do try to offer it as a soup to nuts program. The program is about 3 months long, and for the first 3 courses, you meet about twice a week for 2 hours a time. And so each course is about 12 hours of direct instruction plus some time outside of class where you're doing those brain teasers that Ethan mentioned. So it's very robust. And then, yes, again, the last course in the program is the practicum, the independent practicum. We have cohorts starting in a couple weeks. Actually, this is a fully online cohort, so we'll be starting January 21st. If you're interested in joining that, go ahead and check it out on allenacademy.com, register now. And you can find more information about the program and the faculty on allenacademy.com, just in general. We will be starting a mixed cohort, something we call a mixed cohort, in February at the Training Magazine Conference. So if you're planning on attending that conference anyway, go ahead and look for our pre-conference programs there, and you'll be able to take the first course of the program on site in Orlando, and then continue with the rest of the courses online after that. There are going to be additional cohorts starting throughout the rest of the year, and we are looking at spinning up some additional instruction for Captivate, so it won't just be Storyline. So take a look and keep out keep your social media and your inbox tuned for that news. If you have any other questions about the program, about custom cohorts, if you'd like to get a custom configuration for multiple people at your company, that's something we're really happy to do. Email us at provost@alani.com, and we will be happy to get as many answers to you as we possibly can. This has been great to hear your feedback about the session and your questions about the course. Ethan, is there anything I'm missing and I didn't touch on here in the last couple minutes?
No, I think you did a great job of capturing it. I know we've been having a great time in the courses we're running. I think people are finding it very, very, very helpful. So.
Yes, getting great feedback. And it's a blessing to be able to work with people in such a, continuous, like, intimate way. I think get to really know people.
Yeah, we all have our predispositions, and I know I sort of feeling like, well, you lack that unity when you're online, but I'm really finding that we have a real sense of camaraderie and knowledge because we have the same group of people going through together, that it really feels very natural and very, very close.
Yeah, I agree. Any way to pre-register? Okay, so I think we're going to leave the webinar running for a little bit. Ethan, if you have any questions for Ethan about Storyline or additional questions about the program, feel free to hang on a little bit and you can type those questions in chat, and we will answer them as best we can. Thank you all for joining. You were a great group from all over the world. It was great to see everyone kind of coming in and engaging with the content. And Ethan, thank you for putting together such a helpful session.
Okay, if anybody is hanging on to ask a question about the actual Storyline stuff, go ahead and retype your question in chat, just so I know what the issue was. And thank you all for attending as you're leaving.